The dinners that once filled our plates weren't just meals. They were quiet proof of how little we had and how hard we fought to make it enough. What did we lose when those humble, forgotten foods disappeared from our tables and our memories? Cream-chipped beef on toast was the kind of meal that did not ask for approval. It just showed up. Soldiers had it in mess halls, factory workers had it on break. And if you grew up poor, you probably stared at that milky white sauce clinging to thin strips of salty beef, wondering why it always tasted like desperation with a pinch of comfort. The dish was nicknamed SOS, and no, that did not stand for Save Our Souls, though maybe it should have. It was stuff on a shingle, if you want the cleaned-up version. A slice of toast, barely toasted, because who was wasting electricity on that? Then came the sauce, a flour-thickened mix of butter, milk, and cheap dried beef. Sometimes not even real beef, just salty mystery meat that tried its best. It hit the plate with a wet slap, and you ate it not because you wanted to, but because it was there. Because there was nothing else. It was World War leftovers cooked for peacetime kitchens, and it filled you up, whether you liked it or not. Today, it lives mostly in memory and old military cookbooks. But for those who ate it every week, it is not something you forget. You never really forget what it feels like to scrape the last bit of sauce off your plate with a slice of bread you wish was thicker. Tuna noodle casserole was the king of kitchen creativity. If you had a can of tuna, a box of noodles, and a single can of soup, you had dinner. This was the casserole that held families together after World War II, the kind of meal that said, "We are broke, but we still eat warm." You dumped the noodles in boiling water, stirred in the tuna, and cracked open that can of cream of mushroom soup like it was the secret to survival. It all went into one big dish, mixed until gray and gloppy, then topped with whatever crunch you could find. Maybe crushed potato chips, maybe stale breadcrumbs. If you were lucky, a little shredded cheese. But that was rare. Tuna noodle casserole was not supposed to taste good. It was supposed to be enough. And it was. It warmed up the house and made it smell like something was baking. That mattered more than you think. Sometimes it fed 6 people on $3. Sometimes you made it again the next day with what was left in the pan. It was frugal, filling, and strangely comforting. And if you grew up poor, it probably sat in front of you more times than you care to admit, steam rising off the top like it was proud to be what it was. Macaroni and tomatoes were a Depression-era classic, simple, humble, and oddly satisfying. This was not pasta. It was just boiled elbow noodles drowning in stewed tomatoes, maybe with a spoonful of butter if you had it. Some families added sugar to cut the acidity, others added salt and pepper and called it gourmet. Either way, it was a bowl of starch and acidity that somehow passed for dinner. You would eat it with a fork because spoons were for people who made soup. Macaroni and tomatoes made no apologies. It was what you threw together when the pantry had almost nothing but cans and carbs. It filled your stomach and quieted the kind of hunger that made your ribs ache. And sometimes, just sometimes, it tasted like home. The sauce stained your bowl orange and clung to the bottom like it wanted to stay. If you ever asked what was for dinner and got this, you knew things were tight. And you also knew not to complain, because no one had time for complaints. You just ate, chewed slow, and wondered how something so bland could feel so familiar. That is what makes it special. It was not delicious, it was dependable. Porcupine meatballs sounded fun, until you realized the only thing spiky about them was the desperation they were made from. These were meatballs born in the hard times, made by mixing ground beef with uncooked rice to stretch every last ounce of protein. They simmered in tomato sauce, and as the rice cooked, it poked out like little white quills. That is where the name came from, someone trying to make poverty sound cute. But if you grew up poor, you know this was not about being clever. It was about making half a pound of ground beef feed a family of 5. They were fragile little things, barely holding together, and often baked in the oven or cooked in a pan until the sauce bubbled up like lava. The tomato sauce was always the cheapest kind, canned, oversalted, and slightly metallic. But it masked the blandness, and that was the goal. Sometimes people added onions or eggs if they had them. Most of the time, it was just the basics: rice, meat, and sauce. Dinner done cheap. If you ever sat at the table with 3 meatballs and a slice of bread, you knew what this meal meant. It was survival with a side of improvisation. Hot dogs and baked beans were the dinner of choice when you had 5 mouths and $1. This was not about taste. This was about calories. You dumped a can of beans into a pot, sliced up some hot dogs, and let the whole thing simmer until it bubbled like lava in a cartoon. The beans were sweet, sticky, and filled with brown sugar or molasses, depending on the brand or the sale. The hot dogs were sometimes boiled first, but usually not. They were cut into coins and stirred in like meat confetti. You served it with white bread, not because it matched, but because it was there. No plates necessary, just bowls and spoons and the quiet acceptance that this was dinner, again. For some kids, this meal was a treat. For others, it was a warning sign. You knew what kind of week it was by how often it showed up. Still, it filled you up, and that mattered. The salt hit your tongue and stayed there. Even now, you probably remember that smell. Sweet, smoky beans and sizzling hot dogs coming from a chipped pot on a rusty stove. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor kid's steak. You slapped that bologna in a hot pan until it curled like a rose petal, then threw it on white bread with a smear of mustard. If you were lucky, a slice of cheese made an appearance. If not, the bologna had to carry all the weight. It sizzled, popped, and released that smell, salty, greasy, unmistakable. There was always that little charred ring around the edge, a perfect halo of survival. This was not deli meat. This was the cheapest pack in the fridge. It came in a big plastic tube, sealed with a twist tie or worse, and you knew it was going to last all week. You did not toast the bread. You barely buttered the pan. The goal was simple: get it hot and slap it together. Sometimes there was ketchup, sometimes a pickle slice. But most times, it was just the basics, a sandwich that told you exactly where you stood. You sat on the floor or leaned over the sink while you ate it, grease dripping down your hand, and never questioned why this was a staple. Because it worked, and because it was yours. Sloppy Joes were chaos in a bun. They were sweet, tangy, sticky, and somehow always managed to spill no matter how carefully you ate them. This was not just a school lunch special. It was dinner for anyone trying to make a pound of ground beef stretch to its limits. The sauce was ketchup, sugar, vinegar, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire if your family had that kind of spice rack. You browned the meat, dumped in the sauce, stirred it until it bubbled, then plopped it on the cheapest hamburger buns you could find. The kind that disintegrated under pressure. If you were feeling fancy, maybe you toasted the buns. If you were feeling realistic, you just got paper towels ready. Sloppy Joes made no effort to be elegant. They were messy, loud, and comforting, the kind of meal that made a mess of your face and your plate, but you ate every bite because it tasted like sugar and salt and home. You ate fast because it would soak through the bread if you waited, and you never complained because this was one of the good ones, one of the rare meals that actually felt like a treat. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Goulash was not Hungarian, not the kind we grew up with. This was American goulash, elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a tomato sauce that always tasted a little like metal. It was a one-pot meal, no rules, just a way to take cheap ingredients and turn them into something that could feed a small army. Some families used onions, others added garlic if they had it. But at its core, it was just meat, pasta, and sauce. And it was enough. You could scoop it out in huge portions and still have leftovers. It reheated well. It was easy to make. And most importantly, it was cheap. Goulash was the dinner you made when you could not afford variety. It was everything in one dish. And it worked. You knew it was going to be a goulash night when the cupboards were getting low and the mood in the house was just a little more tired, but somehow that big pot of steaming pasta made things feel okay. For one night at least. Liver and onions were the meal that tested your strength. This was not a dinner kids begged for. It was one you survived. A plate of pan-fried beef liver, dark and dense, smothered in soft, translucent onions that were supposed to make it taste better. The smell alone was enough to make you gag. But liver was cheap. It was full of nutrients. And it was not rationed like other cuts during wartime. So you ate it. You cut tiny pieces and tried to swallow without chewing. You drowned it in ketchup or mustard, anything to make it go down faster. Your parents called it good for you. You called it punishment. But there it was, week after week, staring back at you from a chipped plate, while the onions slid around like ghosts. And if you finished it, you felt like you had won something. You had not. But you felt that way. And sometimes, that was enough. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food. Not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up over the sink or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were the sweet spot between hunger and childhood. No stove, no knife skills, no effort. Just 2 slices of white bread, 1 spread of peanut butter, 1 of jelly, smashed together until they stuck. You did not toast it. You did not plate it. You wrapped it in napkins or ate it straight from the counter. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was always there. The peanut butter clung to the roof of your mouth. The jelly ran down your fingers, and somehow you never minded. It felt like a treat even though it was a budget lifeline. You ate it when the pantry was bare and the lunchbox had to look full. You ate it at home, at school, and on car rides when the air conditioning did not work. It was portable, durable, and forgivable. No one asked questions if that was your meal again, because everyone understood. It was the great equalizer of being broke. No leftovers, no dishes, just sweetness, salt, and survival on sliced bread. Rice and gravy was the meal that whispered, "We made it work," after a long, hungry day. Plain white rice, nothing more than starch and steam, was cooked in big pots that never emptied as fast as you thought. And the gravy? That was magic. You scraped the bottom of the meat pan, mixed the fat and flour, maybe some milk if you were lucky, and stirred until it thickened. There was no meat, not really, just the memory of it. But the gravy carried the flavor like a story passed down from better times. You poured it over the rice and watched it disappear into the grains, turning white into brown, bland into bold. It was hot, heavy, and exactly what you needed. Sometimes there was no salt, sometimes no butter, but always the same bowl, the same spoon, the same quiet hope that tomorrow's meal would be more. Rice and gravy was not flashy. It was not celebrated, but it showed up and it stayed. Cornbread and milk was a southern lullaby disguised as dinner. You took day-old cornbread, dry, crumbly, almost stale, and dropped it into a glass of cold milk. No sugar, no spice. just spoon and memory. It was humble food, the kind you did not question because your grandparents ate it too. Some people used buttermilk, others regular. It depended on what was left in the fridge and how soft you needed the bread to be. You ate it with a spoon, slowly, like it was soup. It filled you without asking for attention. It was cheap, simple, and oddly soothing. There was something honest about it, like admitting you had little but making peace with it anyway. In some homes, this was a treat. In others, a last resort. Either way, it kept bellies full and silence at the table. That matters more than most people know. Potato soup was the warmth you clung to when the cold came early and the paycheck came late. You peeled potatoes with dull knives, boiled them in water, and added onions if you had them. The broth was made from milk, or sometimes just more water and hope. It was not fancy. It was not thick. But it was hot and filling and honest. Some families added cheese or bacon bits if they had a little extra. Most just salted it until it tasted like something. You ate it slowly, holding the bowl in your hands like it might warm more than just your fingers. Leftovers were poured into jars and reheated for the next night. It was the kind of soup that stretched itself to meet your needs. It never judged you for having nothing else. And in that way, it did more than feed you. It forgave you. Beans and cornbread was the gospel of the broke South. Pinto beans soaked overnight, slow-cooked all day, and served steaming hot with a thick slice of cornbread. This was not just dinner. This was survival seasoned with tradition. The beans were soft and earthy, flavored with salt, onions, or maybe a ham hock if someone blessed you. The cornbread was crumbly and golden, sometimes sweet, sometimes not, depending on what part of the country raised you. It was not just a recipe, it was a ritual passed down from someone who learned to stretch a dime into dignity. Even if it was humble, it still brought people to the table like it was a Sunday feast. You broke off chunks and dipped them into the beans like it was communion. And in some ways, it was. Families gathered around it. Conversations started over it. Empty stomachs were quieted by it. It was a meal you could eat for days without getting tired of it because it tasted like home, like history, like someone cared enough to soak the beans instead of rushing a can. And even if they had to rush it, canned beans and boxed cornbread mix, it still counted. It always did. Fried potatoes and onions were the poor man's hash, a skillet full of sizzling honesty. You sliced the potatoes thin, tossed them in a pan with oil or bacon grease, and added onions until the whole house smelled like something was finally cooking. It was loud, smoky, and always worth the wait. The edges got crispy, the centers stayed soft, and the onions caramelized just enough to make you forget there was no meat. There was no recipe, just instinct and repetition, the kind passed down by watching, not reading. One pan, one burner, and the hope that there was enough to go around. You flipped it with whatever spatula had not melted yet, served it right out of the pan, and ate it fast before the crisp turned to mush. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever you needed it to be. You could dress it up with ketchup or cheese or just eat it plain. No one judged. It was filling, cheap, and tasted better than most things you could afford. In the right moment, it tasted like comfort. In the wrong one, it tasted like the only option. But either way, it got the job done. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski if your grandma called it that, was a gift from the old country wrapped in poverty. You boiled egg noodles until they were soft, but not mush. You fried cabbage and onions in butter or oil until they collapsed into golden ribbons. Then you tossed it all together and prayed the flavor was enough. It was peasant food, proudly so. Born from resourcefulness, not recipes. Even when money vanished, this meal stayed dependable, like a friend who never left. It was not pretty, and it did not try to be. Just beige on beige with a hint of steam. But it filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel like someone was taking care of you. Even if that someone was just you, doing your best. The dish had roots in Eastern Europe, but in American kitchens it became something else. An immigrant memory passed down through empty cupboards and tight budgets. You could eat a giant plate for under $1 and still feel like you ate something real. Because you did. Shepherd's pie was the meal of second chances. You took yesterday's meat, mixed it with whatever vegetables you had, canned peas, frozen corn, even just onions, and laid it down like the foundation of something better. Then you spread mashed potatoes on top like frosting, soft and thick and hopeful. Into the oven it went, and out came something that looked and smelled like you tried. It was the art of disguise. Leftovers turned into something new. Scraps turned into comfort. You scooped it out with a spoon, the layers blending together in a hot, savory mess that never looked perfect, but always felt right. It made the table feel full, even when the fridge was empty. And sometimes that illusion was all you needed to keep going. Shepherd's pie reminded you that with enough heat and time, even the broken pieces could come together. Chili and crackers were the meal you made when you needed fire in your belly and not much else. Ground beef, a can of beans, tomato sauce, and every spice you could find in the back of the cabinet. You let it simmer until it thickened, bubbling and bold. The kind of dish that fogged up the windows and warmed up the room. You served it with saltine crackers, always saltines, stacked on the side or crumbled right in. Sometimes there was shredded cheese, sometimes a dollop of sour cream. But usually, it was just the basics. And that was fine, because chili did not need help. It had enough heat, enough bite, enough heart. You ate it with a spoon too big for the bowl and left the table feeling like you had won something. Maybe you had. Fish sticks and macaroni and cheese was the dinner you got when your mom had $5, 20 minutes, and nothing left to give. The fish sticks came from the freezer aisle, packed in a cardboard box with a picture that made them look golden and crispy, but never did justice to the soggy reality. You lined them on a baking sheet and hoped they would brown, even though the oven was spotty and the heat uneven. Then came the macaroni, bright orange and neon from a powdered cheese packet, boiled until it was soft enough to forget where it came from. You stirred the cheese in with butter, or maybe just milk if the butter was gone. And there it was, a plate that was hot, fast, and filling. You did not question if the fish was really fish. You dipped it in ketchup or tartar sauce and made peace with the crunch or the lack of it. The macaroni clung to your fork like it knew its job was to comfort. This was a Thursday night meal, a we'll go shopping tomorrow meal, a you're still growing meal. It was not gourmet, but it was enough. Enough to fill you, enough to get by. Canned ravioli was the Italian dinner that came in a can and never asked for praise. You popped open the metal lid, poured the heavy red sauce into a pot or a bowl, and microwaved it until it bubbled around the edges. The smell was artificial, the sauce too sweet, and the ravioli too soft, but none of that mattered, because it was food. And sometimes that was the only requirement. Chef Boyardee was not a chef in your kitchen, he was a lifeline, a shortcut to something that felt like a meal even if it came from a shelf instead of a stove. You ate it straight from the bowl, sometimes with a slice of bread to soak up the sauce. Other times, just a fork and a quick prayer that no one noticed how many nights in a row you were eating the same thing. The meat inside the pasta was more memory than substance, a whisper of protein in a sea of tomato. But it was hot, and it was filling, and it kept the stomach quiet when the cupboards were mostly bare. You were not proud of it, but you were grateful, because for $1 or less, it gave you something to hold on to. Television dinners were what happened when the future met the food budget. Frozen meals in foil trays, stacked in the freezer like little time capsules of convenience. Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, peas or corn, a square of apple cobbler that always burned your tongue. You pulled it from the box, popped it in the oven, and waited. No prep, no planning. Just peel back the foil and pretend you were eating like everyone else. These dinners were born in the 1950s, but they stuck around because they made sense. Especially when you worked late or your parents were too tired to cook, or there just was not enough of anything to make a real meal. The food never looked like the picture. But it was hot. It had variety. It felt like a feast when you only expected a sandwich. You ate it in front of the television, a tray on your lap, the glow of the screen making it all feel a little more okay. These dinners were never about flavor, they were about escape. Meatloaf was a handshake between hard times and good intentions. It was not steak, it was not even roast. It was ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs, onions, and eggs, molded into a loaf like it wanted to be something more. You baked it in a pan until the edges browned, and if you had ketchup, you glazed the top until it caramelized into a sweet, sticky crust. Meatloaf was a family meal, a leftover meal, a please God let this last 3 days kind of meal. It sat in the center of the table like it was proud to be made out of scraps. And maybe it was. It held together, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Slice by slice, you ate it with mashed potatoes or just plain white bread, soaking up every bit of flavor. It was dense, it was heavy, and it was honest. Because Meatloaf never pretended to be more than what it was, a way to make something out of not enough. Cabbage soup was the dinner of last resort, but it never let you down. You took a head of cabbage, chopped it rough, and threw it into boiling water or broth. Add onions, add carrots, add whatever vegetables you could scrounge from the crisper. The broth was thin, sometimes flavored with a bouillon cube, sometimes just salt and pepper. But it filled the house with steam and the smell of something cooking, something real. You served it in big bowls, sometimes with bread, sometimes without. It was watery, it was plain, but it was warm, and it kept your belly full. Some families made it with a little ground meat or sausage if they had it. Most just leaned on the cabbage and hoped it stretched far enough. It was not the kind of soup you bragged about. But it was the kind you remembered, because it showed up when there was almost nothing left. Pancakes for dinner was the rebellion no one talked about, but everyone loved. You mixed flour, milk, and eggs in a bowl, poured it onto a hot griddle, and watched the bubbles rise like tiny promises. Stack after stack, golden and imperfect, sometimes burnt at the edges. It felt like cheating, but no one called it out. In a house full of stress and unpaid bills, it was the rare moment that felt light. Pancakes reminded us we could bend the rules without breaking ourselves. You poured syrup until it pooled at the base, or you used jam, honey, or even just sugar and butter. Whatever you had, dinner did not have to be savory. It did not have to follow the rules. Pancakes were a reminder that even when money was tight, you could still enjoy something. You could still treat yourself. Kids loved it. Adults sighed with relief. No meat, no sides, just breakfast masquerading as dinner. And maybe that is what made it so special. It felt like breaking the rules in the best possible way. Ramen noodles were the dinner of desperation that somehow became a ritual. A block of dried noodles, a packet of salt and spice, and 3 minutes in boiling water. That was it. That was the whole recipe. And yet, it kept showing up in pantries, college dorms, first apartments, and homes where money ran out before the month did. You could dress it up, sure, but no one was fooled. It was hunger food, dressed in hot broth and convenience. And somehow that truth only made it more familiar. You slurped it straight from the bowl, steam burning your face, the broth clinging to your lips. Sometimes you added an egg, sometimes hot sauce, but most times you just made do. The noodles were limp, the broth was salty enough to sting, but it was food, and food meant one more night survived. You did not eat it because you wanted to. You ate it because it was all you could afford, and you learned to love it anyway. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, what can I do with leftovers? You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean out the fridge dish, the we cannot waste anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Grilled cheese and tomato soup was the closest thing to comfort food that poverty could buy. 2 slices of bread, a single slice of cheese. Into the pan it went, sizzling in butter or margarine until golden brown. You flipped it once, maybe twice, careful not to burn it. The cheese melted just enough to glue it all together. You knew this was poor man's food, but it never tasted that way. It tasted like someone tried. It tasted like effort, not leftovers. Then came the tomato soup, hot, red, and straight from the can. You poured it into a chipped bowl and dipped the sandwich in until it softened at the edges. That was the bite. The one that made it feel like someone cared. This was a sick day meal, a snow day meal, a we still have cheese meal, and it felt like a hug every time. Even now, the smell alone can take you back. Canned Vienna sausages were the snack that somehow became dinner more often than anyone wanted to admit. You pulled back the metal lid, revealing 6 or 7 tiny pink sausages floating in mystery liquid. They smelled like salt and metal and something vaguely meaty. You ate them cold, straight from the can, or warmed them in a pot if you had time. Sometimes you served them with crackers, sometimes just with your fingers. No one dreamed of Vienna sausages, but we learned to respect them. They were there when fresh food was not. They tasted like hard times, but also like resilience. They were soft, almost mushy, but full of protein and easy to store. In homes where refrigeration was unreliable and money was always short, these cans were gold. Not because they tasted good, but because they lasted. They were cheap, reliable, always there when you needed something, anything to put on a plate. You never bragged about eating Vienna sausages, but you remembered them, because they saw you through more hard days than you can count. Walk the streets of Texas, New Mexico, or Oklahoma for a while in the 90s, and you'll soon find an abundance of Tex-Mex food, such as Frito pies. These pies were for people who were into all things savory. Really, on a budget, you could have a pie crust full of chili, cheese, and some corn chips, and it was a fun way of repurposing these cheap and bare-bones ingredients into something filling, something that could accommodate an entire household. The Frito-Lay company had also been pushing their chips as hard as they could. They wanted to make you believe that there was nothing cheaper than a pack of Fritos, and that really was true for the most part. By the 90s at least, Frito chips barely cost a few cents, and canned chili wasn't even $1. Frito chips were something so intrinsically tied to the childhood routine of so many kids that it's a wonder this thing ever went out of relevancy. Frito pies used to be something that you could find at concession stands at your local football match, school cafeterias, and even diners on the side of the road. People would actually make it right in the chip bag, funnily enough, but hey, the Hispanic community is full of wonderful dishes we've forgotten about. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had, or didn't have, when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying, given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. Some things don't get their time in the spotlight. Some things remain backup dancers, or they share it for a few seconds, but it's not really shining for them. One of those things happens to be our next item: frozen prawn cocktails. They were short-lived, and they got most of their popularity out of just being an eyebrow-raising hybrid cocktail in the 50s, back when that kind of thing was still bold and daring in the American culinary sphere. It was a notable convenience product in the 50s and 60s, but it mostly was just coasting off of the gigantic popularity that shrimp was having as a dinner party starter. This was basically a way to serve that shrimp and cater to that cravings without ever having to prepare any kind of seafood. You might be surprised, but Findus had their hands in these as well, and while shrimp cocktails were a lot more common than these ones, there were loads of bad reviews for these. Mostly, people were just complaining about how the texture and dull sauce would make itself all too apparent as soon as you defrosted or thawed it. This was of course going to happen since it was frozen, but it basically meant that you got this really icky drink at worst and an inconvenience paired with your steak at best, which are both things you don't want to be dealing with on your one night out on Saturday. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve the flavor. A few cooks even added milk, breadcrumbs, or a touch of lemon juice to brighten the dish. But if you were lucky, it might be topped with a dollop of whipped cream. But that was a luxury. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Prune pudding was surprisingly nutritionally rich for its simplicity. It wasn't just a treat, it was practical sustenance packed with fiber and vitamins. But its reputation as a digestive aid made it a divisive dessert. It wasn't everyone's idea of a sweet indulgence, to put it mildly. Prune pudding has faded into the background today, often overshadowed by more flashy desserts. In a world fixated on superfoods and functional eating, maybe it's time for this Depression-era favorite to come back. But don't expect it to replace chocolate cake anytime soon. So, during the Depression, one kind of stew that really made the rounds and was a mainstay in people's homes was Hoover stew. This pretty much symbolized the resourcefulness of the era and how people would manage to scrape by no matter what. Did you know that unemployment reached around 25% of the entire workforce just by 1933? It meant that a lot of families were surviving off of literally nothing. It was in times like that when people came up with Hoover stew. One of the best things about recipes from that time period is that they were built to make ingredients last. Hoover stew itself consisted of macaroni and the really cheap kind. Next, you had your canned corn, tomatoes, and canned green beans. For a bit of protein, people got the cheapest hot dog sausages they could manage to find. Lastly, some basic seasonings like chili powder and seasonings. You'll notice that a lot of Depression-era recipes tend to use vegetables as a filler ingredient so that the protein reserves last longer. If most of the meals consisted largely of meat, then nobody would be eating chicken for too long. Hoover stew was made in soup kitchens. Most of the time, these places would be run by charities or community groups that wanted to cook for entire neighborhoods and see that their area was taken care of. That worked with the nature of Hoover stew too, since this was by default a recipe you make for a large group. It was really easy to make it in batches, and for a long time, lots of communities would pass around bowls of stew on winter nights to feel better. Also, Hoover stew became a sign of public frustration as well. The name comes from President Hoover, whose government and policies were pretty much very suspect by this point in time. People would usually serve Hoover stew at relief centers to either the impoverished and homeless or to struggling neighborhoods. It didn't have any flair, it didn't look the best, and it certainly wasn't the best stew you could get, but it was still worth making. For a long while, it kept everybody well fed. Plus, when the government did eventually switch to Roosevelt's administration, his New Deal food relief programs relied on recipes like Hoover stew a lot to keep hunger under control. Native to the Americas, maize or corn was first domesticated around 9,000 years ago in what is now Mexico. And to be honest, corn didn't just survive history, it dominated it. From the mighty Mayans to the resourceful Native American tribes, maize was life because it was versatile, filling, and easy to grow. Corn didn't demand pampering. It thrived in poor soil and harsh climates, producing large harvests. Turn it into cornmeal, and suddenly, you've got food that stores well, travels easily, and lasts for months. Whether baked into cornbread, boiled into porridge, or rolled into tortillas, cornmeal became the cornerstone of survival and culture. Maize was so vital that the Mayans literally worshipped a corn god. And they weren't wrong. Nutritionally, maize is packed with carbs for energy, fiber for digestion, and, when paired with beans, it forms a near-perfect protein. When Europeans arrived, they were blown away by this golden crop and quickly took it global. Corn became polenta in Italy, grits in the American South, and countless dishes worldwide. While corn may seem humble today, it's nothing short of legendary. It fed empires, crossed oceans, and still manages to show up in everything from snacks to fuel. In the 1970s, almost every kind of home, especially the ones that didn't have a lot of income to work with, whether they were situated in urban centers or rural outskirts, relied on basically just winging it. Recipes had to be flexible and adaptable, and the ingredients in them had to have easy and cheap substitutes. A pound of pasta may have just been a few dollars, but it was something that would last you for so many meals. Beans, on the other hand, were as cheap as they could get. For around 50 cents or $1, you could have an entire can. Mayonnaise wasn't ever something you would associate with pasta or beans, but that's exactly where we're going. The funny thing about being broke is it can make you part with tradition real fast. Even Italian traditionalists that would, in any other circumstance, be pretty opinionated about the use of mayonnaise in pasta would have it that way with beans. You could have a creamy dressing that turned pasta into something more, and it was also something that let families experiment and see what works best for them. You could find it all over the South and North. Instead of one specific city, this dish simply just endured throughout the country. Though honestly, some people decided to save things up and go home instead. For a week or two, just to relax, you know? Anyway, at home, people's diets were changing in yet another way once again. Top round roasts were a really good example of this. They were something you would get from the round, primal cut of beef, and they were a really common voice for most families that wanted to eat on a reasonable budget. Hey, if you try to weasel your way out of buying good meat, you often end up with bad and tough cuts that are almost like rubber to chew, and no one wants that. Top round roasts were so nice and popular exactly because they were an affordable lean cut, a previously never-before-seen phenomena in the lands of the United States. This lean cut was something that was really adaptable too. You can make it in all kinds of cooking methods. You could roast it, slow cook it, grill it, or even make a patty out of it. Plus, for $1.50 per pound, who was really competing with stuff like this? I mean, sure, it was no ribeye, but at least you had a roast to come back to. That's why people would save up and go home, because at some point, the ramen noodles start to get really old. Ritz cracker meat pies were basically just your average meat pie affair, but with Ritz crackers thrown on top. Not really too inspiring, I know, but hey, it worked. Why do you think people resorted to something this simple? A lot of the time, it was less about the flavor, the texture, and what it was adding to the dish, and it was more about the fact that something new was being thrown in at all. The thing about sticking to a budget is that you really can't step out of it. You can't get a sweet little treat for yourself. You can't spend extra on white sugar instead of brown sugar. You can't afford that extra bit of flour, or that fancy cheese, or the wine. Never the wine. Regardless, sticking to a budget means suppressing your heart every day, because at the end of each and every 24 hours, you just need the money more. You might be happy in the moment when you cave into the impulse and get the thing you have your eyes set on, but when you're in bed worrying about your finances, you'll regret it. Ritz crackers, on the other hand, were literally just for a few cents. What harm could that cause? What could it do? Not only did it work as a breakfast option with toast or tea, but it also worked amazingly as a substitute for breadcrumbs. On meat pies, it was something that helped give them a crispier crust and edge, which honestly made a world of difference to people who were deeply bored of meat pies by the 90s. Honey. Nature's sweet, sticky miracle. While we typically think of honey as just a tasty treat for our toast or tea, it's also been a lifesaver for thousands of years. Honey's a natural preservative, and believe it or not, it can last forever. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs, still perfectly edible after 3,000 years. Why is honey so special? Well, its unique combination of low moisture content and natural acidity creates an environment where bacteria and microorganisms can't grow. Essentially, honey is like Mother Nature's own preservative. In ancient times, honey was used to preserve fruits, meat, and even as a wound dressing. While your pantry might not last for 3,000 years, that jar of honey? It's good to go, forever. The ancient Greeks and Romans used honey to sweeten wine, and it even made its way into their medicinal practices. Honey was critical for survival. It was a quick source of energy, easy to store, and never spoiled. Do you like Cadbury chocolate? Me too. It's nice, isn't it? Well, if you came for their chocolate, you might just end up staying for their Smash Instant Mashed Potatoes, which, yes, really is by the same company. It became such a joke in the country at some point because of the non-stop advertising that was going around these. I mean, some of them even had Martian robots for some reason. Can you believe that? Not sure about their own planet, but they definitely did an amazing job at making it a staple name in most homes on ours. In the 1970s, American brands were really trying to follow the lead that Cadbury set over here. They wanted to capitalize on the fact that convenience food culture was now spreading even to things like mashed potatoes, which before, no one would have guessed. The flavor profile here was also eerily similar to what you would expect out of a typical plate of mashed potatoes. They had the same softness, the same mushiness, and brands like Pillsbury got pretty far ahead with their pre-made products. Anything that made dieting easier was something that people would rely on. Still though, why can't we find a middle ground? At least that's the kind of idea people were going for with Vienna sausages and other frozen food. The idea was really simple. Vienna sausages were pretty much these small canned sausages that were like a charcuterie board of different meats. You had pork, beef, and chicken all mixed into one to make this sausage, and they were honestly in everyone's cabinets and shelves by the 80s. They were something that Americans held on to dearly. Soft, pre-cooked and ready to go, already packed in a light broth for added preservation, this was one of the best things you could. Plus, it was literally just for like 40 or 60 cents, and depending on the kind of brand, you could make it a really varied dish. You could have a sandwich, a casserole, eggs and bacon, or whatever else it was, all from the same box of Vienna sausages you had gotten. Plus, they were really easy to work with. Even your kids could make them. Hot dogs are a funny one. It's arguably the most American thing to ever America, but it's also something that's kind of never in the forefront. I mean, it's like Bugs Bunny. You know he's him, like he's basically the Michael Jordan of cartoons, right? Who's beating Bugs Bunny in polls? No one. Yet when there's a new exciting animated movie, who do you usually see? It's definitely not Bugs Bunny. Puss in Boots, Shrek, Elsa, hot dogs are the same. You go down the street, turn a corner to your favorite deli or roadside stall, or just walk into a grocery store, and you'll see all kinds of options for hot dogs. Is it ever something that's at the top of your timeline, making rounds on the internet, or on the front cover of a cookbook or one of the most heavy-hitting recipes? Not really. Do I blame them? No, after all, it is just a hot dog. Yet if you're broke, hungry, and too tired to think, it's arguably the best meal you can ever get for yourself. Hot dogs were something that brought so much relief to a bunch of different people, working class and wealthy homes alike. A pack of these for $1 would net you around 8 dogs, and a pack of buns would range around 50 cents. Throw in some canned beans and you're pretty much set. So in less than $3, you could go to bed pretty damn satisfied. Who needs deli meat when you've got potato peels? During the Great Depression, even scraps were too valuable to waste, and that was the sentiment. Potato peel sandwiches were the epitome of making do and turned what most of us would toss into a surprisingly hearty meal. Stuffed between slices of bread, and if you were lucky, slathered with a bit of butter or lard, the peels were cleaned and fried in whatever grease was available. It's kind of like a rustic early version of a loaded potato skin sandwich. The crispy, slightly salty peels added a nice texture to otherwise plain bread. Sometimes onions or garlic would be thrown in for added flavor. And if you had cheese, jackpot. This humble meal was filling and resourceful and showed you didn't have to spend much to make something comforting. Potato peel sandwiches might seem like a relic of the past, but they've quietly influenced modern cooking trends. Today, zero-waste recipes and root-to-stem cooking draw inspiration from the same resourceful spirit. Chefs now celebrate potato peels as the star of gourmet dishes, seasoning them with truffle oil or pairing them with artisanal bread. The humble sandwich, once a survival tactic, has found new life as a talking point in sustainability circles. It's fascinating how something born out of necessity can inspire culinary innovation decades later. Maybe it's time to bring them back, not out of desperation, but out of respect for their history. In Alabama, what was native to people were things like black-eyed and field peas, which provided a lot of steady protein to the locale there for barely any money. That was the kind of food that kept people going back then, because you essentially wanted to maximize your value for money. Every cent counted more than ever before, and it was a rough time that led to a lot of people completely reworking their diets and eating habits to keep up with the times. Usually these peas would be mixed with molasses or syrup and enjoyed in do-it-yourself soups that would kind of work, but they wouldn't really taste good. Then again, as long as it was nutritious and cheap, no one could complain. Preserved foods are time-tested essentials, expertly crafted to outlast the seasons and keep hunger at bay no matter the circumstances. Salted meat. The original meat preservation hack before freezers were even a dream. Whether it was jerky, salted fish, or cured pork, this method was a game changer for survival because salt is basically nature's food kryptonite. It stops bacteria in their tracks, keeping meat edible for weeks, months, or even years. For our ancestors, this meant protein on demand. No spoilage, no waste, just salty goodness. Salt was so valuable in ancient times it was literally used as currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salarium, or salt money. Yep, that's where the word salary comes from. And they weren't just munching on jerky for kicks. Salted meat kept armies marching, sailors sailing, and explorers exploring. It was essential for long journeys when fresh food was impossible to keep. Without it, forget discovering new continents. Most ships wouldn't have made it past week 2. Jerky, dried to chewy perfection, came from indigenous peoples of the Americas, who used the sun, smoke, and salt to preserve meat. Meanwhile, salted cod became the fish that fed the world, fueling trade routes and diets from Europe to the Caribbean. Long-lasting, portable, and packed with protein, it kept people alive and moving. If the idea of cow brain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cow brains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cow brain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cow brain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cow brain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cow brain stew faded into the background. becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cow brain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. Onions and garlic, two kitchen staples that have been bringing flavor and survival to the table for centuries. These little powerhouses don't just make your meals taste amazing, they've got some serious staying power. Forget the fancy spices, onions and garlic were the original go-to ingredients for ancient civilizations. Dating back over 5,000 years to ancient Egypt, garlic, besides being a food, was a medicine. Egyptians believed garlic had magical powers, including the ability to ward off evil spirits. Beyond folklore, garlic has some legit health benefits, like boosting immunity and fighting off infections. A little garlic in your stew might just save your life. Onions have been around for even longer. Some records suggest they were cultivated as far back as 3000 BC in Asia and Egypt. Not only were onions used for cooking, but they were also carried as a form of currency. Think about that next time you're chopping one up for a burger. Onions and garlic store like champs. They don't need refrigeration, and they can last for months when kept in a cool, dry place. That makes them the ultimate survival food, flavor that's ready to go no matter the season. And to be honest, how could things like cup noodles not get old? I mean, the 20th century was special, man. We came up with all kinds of genuinely amazing dishes, and nifty, tricky ones for tough times, like cabbage soup. This was something that people really started to warm up to during the Depression because back then, the popular thing to do was to grow your own produce. No, really. People had a green thumb back then. They were called victory gardens. And the idea was to basically repurpose your own backyard and make it into a little plot you could farm on. One of the easiest things to grow at the time were cabbages. How does all this relate to being broke in the 80s? Well, the thing about the 20th century is that money problems were a big trademark of the entire century. The effects of the combined trifecta of disaster that was the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and both of the world wars left America, its people, and their wallets scarred for an immeasurable amount of time. People couldn't really let go of all the hacks, tricks, and ways of survival they came up with in times like those, especially as they struggled to grapple with the after effects. Cabbage soup was one of the most popular meals to make for working-class families because for 25 to 35 cents, you could feed your family a nutritious meal that could be added to in several different ways. Not a bad deal, right? Hot dog hash is something that takes the timeless American hot dog and mixes it in with alternative ingredients that won't put you in a tight spot. Hot dogs were always one of the most cost-effective sources of protein you could ever get for yourself. A multi-pack would go for less than $1, and what else did you really need to make hot dogs? Some cheese, onions, and maybe a few bits of bacon or olives? The dish was something that showed how innovative the working-class kitchen really could be. Hot dogs were something you would always imagine and place at like a ball game, a busy street corner in a commercial area, or just a family night. It's not something people have as a serious filling meal, but that's really what was being done here. Families would dice these sausages up, fry them with potatoes, spice blends, and onions, and make a hash that would essentially be one of the best breakfasts you could eat for yourself on a budget. Hot dog hash was something that was deeply popular in suburban neighborhoods across the Midwest and Northeast, especially when periods of inflation would get so bad that it would be hard to even afford a typical hot dog. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. If even one of these dinners took you back, tell us your story in the comments. Tap like to honor the struggle, and subscribe so these memories, and the people who lived them, are never forgotten.